Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, testing, testing.
The Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Development will come to order. I note there's a quorum is present. Without objections, the chair is recognized to call at recess at any time. Welcome to today's hearing on strengthening the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. WIOA was enacted in 2014 by a split federal government. Democrats then controlled the Senate and White House, while Republicans controlled the House. At the time, WIOA was a strong step in the right direction. It finally consolidated and attached established federal workforce programs with 6 primary indicators of performance to ensure accountability to the taxpayer. As we fast forward to today, unfortunately, the lingering problems of unemployment and skilled worker shortage is still persistent. The composition of the federal government might mirror that of 2014, but the workforce system today in 2023 is facing greater challenges to equip job seekers with in-demand skills. In July 2014, the United States had 4.8 million unfilled jobs. In July of this year, there were 8.8 million unfilled jobs, an increase of 4 million. Further, the labor force participation rate has not improved since WIOA was first enacted. To distract from this harsh reality, some point to the unemployment rate. The reality is, though, that the employment rate paints an incomplete picture of the American workforce. The real story is that too many young, discouraged men and women have been forced out and are now sitting on the sidelines of our economy. I see a number of bipartisan common sense changes that this committee can make to WIOA to bring these dislocated workers back into the fold. To implement meaningful reform, this committee's North Star has to be maximizing of outcomes for job seekers and employers. We must also improve outcomes by cutting back wasteful and inefficient bureaucracy. We hear from employers across the country that they do not participate in WIOA due to its time-consuming burdens, overly prescriptive requirements, staff modernization, flexibility, and inefficiency. Instead, WIOA should focus on developing where it matters the most. For instance, WIOA contains approximately 75,000 eligible skills development programs. Yet, the lack of performance data for most programs means job seekers and employers are left guessing which programs are valuable. The committee should also look into potential reforms regarding the accountability mechanisms enshrined in WIOA. The inability to obtain workforce performance data is just one issue, but even when data is available, the present system fails to enforce accountability measures. To date, WIOA still implemented according to a lax transition standard meant to ease the state's administrative burdens while adjusting to the 2014 law. Nearly 10 years later, the Department of Labor has not fully implemented WIOA's accountability, meaning every state is considered a performance success despite our workforce malaise. Finally, reform can improve outcomes for job seekers and employers by encouraging innovation. There are provisions of the present law that expressly prohibit states from adapting and innovating to the rapidly changing economy. This could be an easy bipartisan fix, deregulating the key areas like allowing states to restructure how they can make services available to job seekers and employers will help unleash the American workforce. Allowing the innovators to have skin in the game to innovate, job seekers, employers, communities in our country win big time. The American economy is incredible in potential. However, it is abundantly clear that this committee needs to reevaluate and reform various aspects of WIOA to develop on that potential. By cutting bureaucracy, developing accountability, and encouraging innovation, we can ensure a bright and promising future for America's workforce. With that, I yield to the ranking member for her opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairman Owens, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimonies today, and welcome. Thanks to the investment made by congressional Democrats and the Biden administration, the past 2 years were the first and second largest job growth years in American history. American history. Without a doubt, this has been monumental for American workers, for their families, and for the economy. In fact, Our economy has added more than 13 million jobs since President Biden took office. According to the Economic Policy Institute, low-wage workers have experienced the fastest real wage growth seen since during any business cycle peak since 1979. This historic growth was made possible by the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the work of Democrats to build the economy from the bottom up and middle out. These laws secured historic investments to help vulnerable workers, accelerated economic growth, and lowered the cost for everyday families. Democrats remain focused on building the economy from the bottom up and in the middle out. To build on this progress, we can help Americans access and benefit from these new job opportunities by fully investing in our workforce system, reducing barriers for underserved workers, and improving the quality of job opportunities. If we want to improve outcomes for job seekers, employers, and taxpayers, we must put serious money behind the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, while simultaneously holding training providers and workforce boards accountable. Young people, workers forced out of their jobs, and justice-involved individuals are counting on us to work together to improve the workforce system and to meet the demands of the millions of new high-skill, high-wage jobs. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back, and I look forward to a productive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Pursuant to Community Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is October 4th, 2023. And without objections, the hearing record will remain open 14 days, such that such statements and material referenced during the hearing can be submitted for the official record hearing. I now turn to introduce our 4 distinguished witnesses. First witness is Mr. Scott B. Sanders, who is President and CEO of the National Association for State Workforce Agencies, is located here in Washington, D.C. Our second witness is Ms. Rayar Conrad-Bradshaw, who is the Vice President of Corporate Markets for the Cengage Group, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. I now turn to Ranking Member Ms. Wilson to introduce the third witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the honor of introducing the next witness, Mr. Rick Beasley from the great state of Florida. Mr. Beasley is the Executive Director of the South Florida Workforce Investment Board, which serves as the local workforce board for Miami-Dade County and Monroe County. As the Executive Director, Mr. Beasley strives to find solutions to workforce issues paramount to my district's long-term economic viability and the economic mobility of its residents. Thank you for agreeing to testify, Mr. Beasley, and I yield back to the chairman.
And our final witness is Mr. Mason Bishop, who's a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute located here in Washington, D.C. We want to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimonies. Pursuant to community rules, I would ask that each limit your oral presentation to 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibilities to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I will first recognize Mr. Sanders.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify on behalf of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, or NASWA. The members of our nonpartisan association are the state leaders and their agency staff of the publicly funded workforce system, which implements the WIOA career services and skills development programs, labor market information programs, and in many instances, other human services programs. Our members represent the 50 state workforce development agencies, plus the agencies in the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. 4 key opportunities to strengthen the management, delivery, and evaluation of WIOA services are: 1, increase flexibility for states; 2, sustain staffing flexibility; 3, strengthen alignment of workforce programs with post-secondary education to support infrastructure and industrial investments; and 4, improve performance measurements and other data-driven strategies. While NASWA members represent different populations, economies, and administrative structures, they agree that increased flexibility is essential. Without such flexibility, states will continue to face challenges in developing and implementing innovative strategies to produce short-term and longer-term results. Based upon their experiences from the field, NASWA members have identified several areas in WIOA for improved state flexibility. The areas for improved state flexibility are expanding eligibility to incumbent workers who are at high risk of displacement, allowing the states to use funding across adult, dislocated workers, and youth programs to better serve their constituents based on the specific need, and improving options under youth programs to allow targeted delivery of services. Since the early 1990s, employment service, or ES staffing flexibility, was used by states that demonstrated alternative staffing models such as Colorado and Michigan. But in 2022, the U.S. Department of Labor reversed course by proposing a new rule that would require state merit staff to deliver ES services, which would potentially disrupt service delivery, impose new costs, and create administrative burdens on the workforce system. Nearly all NASWA members urge the subcommittee to support ES staffing flexibility in WIOA, whether they will exercise this possibility or not. To meet the goals Congress established in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, new partnerships that engage state workforce and education systems, industries, community organizations, and others will be required to enable informed strategic decisions and actions resulting in successful outcomes. Federal agencies must work together to assure that state agencies have a vital role at industry strategic planning tables and support state agencies with the resources, technical assistance, and guidance to ensure the success of historic infrastructure investments. Since 2021, NASWA has supported the creation of multi-state data collaboratives that currently are comprised of almost 30 states from the East, Midwest, and South. These collaboratives support state agencies to increase data quality and analytics and expand access to data and data sharing among workforce system stakeholders. To sustain these collaboratives and expand them to the remaining states, NASWA recommends adding infrastructure and other industry partners to align resources that support informed decision-making, making that go beyond producing just basic state workforce data. NASWA members fully support WIOA's vision for a strong and transparent performance accountability system. For example, the subcommittee could, 1, streamline and improve performance measures by updating indicators based on data currently collected, and 2, make performance target negotiation process more cost-effective and transparent by having the departments propose targets first for states' use. More immediately, NASWA recognizes the time pressure on the subcommittee to improve performance accountability and the use of data to get the model right. NASWA offers to quickly assemble a small group of state performance and technical experts to help you and your staff determine how best to improve WIOA performance accountability, including data use and evaluation. Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share NASWA's view about strengthening WIOA.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders. Now introduce Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to share Cengage Group's perspective on ways to strengthen and modernize the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. My name is Raya Conrad-Bradshaw, and I serve as the Vice President of Corporate Markets for Cengage Group. Cengage Group is one of the largest education technology companies in the world. We provide quality digital products and services to millions of students across the globe with a mission to connect education to employment. I lead our efforts with employers to build talent pipelines and upskilling programs to meet their high-demand workforce needs. I've spent the last dozen years working with higher education, nonprofits, and employers to create innovative solutions, including more than 6 years at the industry-leading workforce provider Year Up. Today, with major technology transformation in our economy, some estimate that up to 40% of the workforce will need to reskill over the next 3 years. At the same time, there are significant talent shortages in jobs critical to America's economy, including more than 300,000 shortage in allied health annually and more than 600,000 in cybersecurity. Given these shortages, our nation must rethink the way in which our workforce obtains and maintains the skills most in demand by employers. As Congress begins to reauthorize WIOA, it must align workforce investment with economic development. In 2021, only 35% of those participating, approximately 223,000 people, received training services through WIOA's adult, dislocated worker, and youth formula grant programs. If we want WIOA to serve more learners and meet the economic imperative, the program must refocus its mission to deliver these skills and competencies needed for the country's most in-demand jobs. One of the most important ways to address this is to improve the eligible training provider list, which is what I was asked to discuss specifically here today. These lists are a critical tool for WIOA participants and employers to determine high-quality, best-in-class providers. According to a recent Harvard report, one of the biggest challenges with the ETPL is that there are collectively more than 75,000 eligible programs from more than 7,000 providers in more than 700 occupational fields. The sheer size and scope of these lists make it hard for participants and employers to navigate and find the right program. Further, most eligible programs do not provide any outcome data on all enrolled, despite the current law's requirement. A new DOL website designed to show performance information by program shows that over 75% lack basic information on completion, employment rates, median earnings, and credentials earned. This is in part due to the lack of consistent methods of collecting data, as well as the cost, time, and difficulty to report on these outcomes. I would like to lay out a few policy recommendations that I would believe would improve the ETPL. First, Congress should work with the U.S. Department of Labor to determine what barriers exist when collecting and publishing data to ensure at least a baseline of every eligible program's outcomes are made public. At a minimum, these outcomes should focus on completion rates, expected earnings, and pass rates for industry-recognized credential attainment. Second, federal, state, and local governments should facilitate access to centralized tools to assist providers in obtaining accurate outcomes data. Such tools would reduce bias in reporting metrics, defray costs of collecting information, increase transparency, and improve resource allocation to target programs that generate results. Third, states should be encouraged to work collectively to recognize best-in-class providers across state lines and prioritize these programs that are employer-sponsored, particularly those where employers have financial skin in the game, provide on-the-job work experience, or commit to providing program completers an opportunity for employment. Fourth, states should create probationary eligibility pathways that allow for innovation and experimentation of new programs and providers which are able to keep up with the pace of change. Fifth, Congress should affirm multiple modalities, including online and hybrid models, as long as they continue to meet the outcome metrics required of all programs. And finally, Congress should allow one-stop career staff the ability to better coordinate federal and state resources, especially between Pell Grants, WIOA individual training accounts, and other federal workforce programs to allow for more flexibility in covering the cost of workforce development programs. I would like to thank the subcommittee for inviting me here today. As you begin the reauthorization of WIOA, I urge you to take a more demand-led approach. These systems must keep pace with industry and with innovation. Otherwise, we risk further widening the wealth gap in our society and contributing to a less competitive position in the global marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Beasley.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Ms. Wilson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, my name is Roger Beasley. I have the distinct pleasure to serve as the Executive Director of the South Florida Workforce Investment Board, and better known as CareerSource South Florida. We are the local workforce investment board that serves the residents and businesses in Miami-Dade and Monroe County. I commend this subcommittee and the House leadership for making continuous transformation of our workforce development system into one that increasingly is flexible, responsive, and innovative, and is a leading priority for this committee. The talent supply challenges confronting our nation at home and global competition abroad requires that we leverage and maximize resources to ensure effective and efficient use of a public workforce investment that addresses talent needs of employers today and tomorrow by bolstering growth and sustainability of jobs in our economy. As Congress considers reauthorization of the Workforce and Innovation Act, it is my honor to highlight specific programmatic and administrative areas that offer guidance to support Congress in fulfilling its mission to increase opportunities, enhance accountability, and reduce administrative waste and improve outcomes for our nation's public workforce system. As the largest workforce investment board in the state of Florida, CareerSource South Florida has implemented a number of initiatives that expand employment training services to job seekers by increasing economic mobility, implemented recruitment and retention tools to address talent supply shortage challenges that faces our business community, and design and launch on-time, real-time tools that evaluate WIA performance outcomes and also evaluate federal compliance requirements. In my written testimony, you'll find more information on how we have focused on these critical areas to enhance outcomes and connect South Floridians to meaningful and training opportunities, as well as help employers find talent that they need to compete and thrive. As an experienced workforce leader in workforce development, it has been my privilege to work not only in Florida, but also in Missouri for more than 24 years. I think there are some clear areas and opportunities for us to continue to improve our public workforce system on the state, local, and federal levels. And I appreciate this opportunity to highlight 3 areas that I want to concentrate on. First, in reauthorizing WIOA, Congress should authorize the Secretary of Labor to utilize opportunity zones to eliminate barriers to determine WIA eligibility. As you all know, opportunity zones has been designated economic areas that are based on past census data. Some opportunity zones are in low-income neighborhoods and cities, while others are in rural areas that geographically are far from large concentrations of jobs and resources. So potential WIA participants living in opportunity zones should automatically qualify for WIA services. The new eligibility standard would allow workforce development boards to expand services in underserved communities, eliminate eligibility barriers for job seekers, and reduce administrative paperwork. In an effort to increase participants in obtaining training services, Congress may establish individual training goals for the use of WIA funding. And based on economic conditions of a local workforce area, states should implement individual training account goals, and these goals would establish percentages of how WIA funding can be targeted for training services. But rest assured, the definition of allowable training activities should include classroom training, on-the-job training, apprenticeship models, customized training, and incumbent worker training, as well as program costs that support participants while they're in training, like case management, support services, and facility costs. And finally, to address financial barriers to economic mobility, Congress should promote the expansion of WIA support services to address issues regarding the benefits cliff. CareerSource South Florida provides support services to participants to aid them in increasing economic self-sufficiency through WIA services, and by adding emphasis on adding emphasis on addressing benefits cliffs, we help mitigate the loss of public benefits for participants who are gaining new skills to qualify for better paying jobs, but are at risk of losing those safety net benefits that remain essential on their path to self-sufficiency. As I conclude, I applaud this committee's effort and commitment to hold hearings such as one this morning to shine and highlight opportunities to improve our nation's public workforce system. I look forward to the question and answer section which allows us a great opportunity to discuss actions and other actions of Congress and other workforce partners that we take to improve our public workforce system. Chairman Owens, this concludes my remarks. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee on the issue that is very vibrant and important for the American innovation and commerce. When appropriate, I welcome the questions from you and the committee as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beasley. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Bishop.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on improvements Congress can make to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Early in my career, I supported Governor Mike Leavitt in negotiating and implementing the legislation that created the Utah Department of Workforce Services, which still stands today as the most integrated public workforce system in the country. From 2001 to 2007, I served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training during the George W. Bush administration, where one of my responsibilities was developing policies and improvements to the Workforce Investment Act, the predecessor to WIOA. I then had the opportunity to go back to Utah and serve as Vice President for Institutional Advancement at Salt Lake Community College, and since 2012, I've been a full-time consultant. As part of my work, I see the challenges faced by communities and families seeking to improve economic conditions, the bureaucratic hurdles faced by workforce development and education staff trying to address the reskilling or upskilling of workers, and the unnecessary complexities of the myriad of federal workforce and education programs. My testimony today provides an outline of specific principles and opportunities to improve WIOA to meet our shared goals of upward mobility, labor force attachment and high wages, and business growth through a skilled and productive workforce. As part of my AEI work, I've issued a landscape study report that documented the 5-decade history of federal involvement in funding employment and education programs. As Congress has sought to address particular workforce and educational challenges over the decades, it's layered program upon program across multiple federal agencies, often with the very strict rules as to both who gets served and, more importantly, how they get served. This approach has led us to where we are today, a continual acknowledgement and frustration that we are still not as efficient and effective as we must be to bolster a skilled workforce in the face of both domestic and global economic challenges. WIOA reauthorization is an important step toward improving this programming, and if we address 3 issues. Number 1, while workforce service delivery is regional, federal efforts to define roles for state and local jurisdictions and service providers has led to unmanageable complexity. I often hear people say that workforce development is local, but that is true in a very limited sense. Starting with CETA in the 1970s, the federal government provided a direct linkage and relationship to local communities, and that linkage remains today through WIOA Title I. However, I point out that all the other program partners other than WIOA Title I are delivered based upon what governors and states decide, including Title II Adult Education, Title III Wagner-Peyser Employment Services, and Title IV Vocational Rehabilitation. Perhaps the most egregious example of federal overreach in defining roles and responsibilities is what Mr. Sanders already talked about, the state merit staffing requirement, where under Wagner-Peyser Employment Services, state employees are mandated to provide employment services, while WIOA Title I, the same exact services are being provided by local employees. That is unmanageable. Number 2, WIOA creates a governance structure that is too prescriptive and defines a single model and service delivery structure for the entire country. Under WIOA, we have the one-stop system, and while the idea of a one-stop service delivery system is important in theory and practice, narrowly defining how the system should work across diverse communities and regional economies incentivizes workarounds and stakeholders meeting basic and minimal requirements without shared ownership of such one-stop system. Third, WIOA lacks tools and incentives for innovation and performance improvements. Since COVID, I've been contacted by numerous states wanting to understand the Utah model and how they can implement it. One state's workforce leadership told me their governor challenged them to be best in class, so they conducted research into what is working. What they found was Utah performed best across the several factors that they developed for measuring best in class. However, and I emphasize this, current WIOA law prohibits states from implementing the Utah model, arguably the best model we have in this country. This is due to 2 factors. Starting with WIA, prescriptive requirements have been legislated that do not comport to the key features of what we implemented in Utah. And number 2, WIOA lacks provisions that allow states to pilot alternative approaches or demonstrate improved performance through innovative ideas and service delivery designs. In my testimony, I give areas of the Utah model that are specific and can answer questions, but I do want to end with 3 things that I promote in my testimony. Number 1 is I believe Congress should create an innovation demonstration authority in legislation to allow states to innovate and provide good flexibility and ideas from the ground up. Number 2, I believe we ought to allow for federal funding flexibility to promote efficient use of resources and integration of related services across programs. And number 3, and I give many examples where we need to restructure WIOA to promote modernized program governance and performance-based service delivery. I'll end by saying that I often like to say that we are trying to operate in an iPhone economy with programs that were created and modeled from the New Deal and Great Society, and they continue to do so. We must modernize this program and provide the governance and service delivery improvements and flexibility that will allow innovation and new ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bishop. Under Committee Rule 9, I will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule, and I will begin the process. Ms. Bishop, I'm proud of the success of Utah has achieved by integrating their workforce services, and I believe that all states should have the same opportunity to pursue Utah's model. That being said, I know there may be other innovative and effective ways to administer workforce development programs. However, the current law, as you just mentioned, does not allow other states to innovate to pursue a better outcome. Can you explain how authorizing a demonstration authority under WIOA might spur innovation at a state and local level?
Yes. We learned in the 1990s that when we provide states with opportunities for flexibility and demonstration, that can lead to better outcomes for individuals who are low income or needing jobs. And so what we believe is that we do not know all the answers. Each state is different. Florida is different than Utah. Florida, for instance, may not want a single state area. They may want to have local workforce boards, for instance. We don't know what each state needs based upon what their constituents are, what their businesses and industries are, and what's happening with this technological economy that's rapidly changing. What we do know is that we can no longer, in my opinion, have a federal workforce law that sets the rules of the game for those that are trying to deliver services and have the same rules across the entire country, because our economies and our businesses and our workers and our communities are so varied and different that we believe let's let states and local communities come up with the ideas that work best for them in return for performance accountability, improving what they can achieve with better outcomes with flexibility.
Thank you. Mr. Sanders, I'd like to point you made in earlier, when you said we don't need to collect even more performance data, related data. We need to focus on data that will be used. In your experience, what data points are most relevant to job seekers and employers?
Obviously, appreciate the comment about collecting more data. For those of you that have looked at the Pearl, you can see how many points of data we collect. I think we need to work with the data we have. I think some of the methodologies to look at collecting data are obviously on earnings outcomes for individuals, even second quarter or fourth quarter out. Obviously looking at both for the same individual, because individuals could leave and go to another job at that point. I think the harder one is on the employer side, and figure out in a metric that works for employers to get employers engaged and to make sure that you can demonstrate to them how you can succeed in them coming to the workforce system to actually fulfill their labor and workforce.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw, you mentioned Cengage work with employers on skill-to-hire programs and emphasize the importance of promoting employer and sponsored programs in the WIOA system. From a student's perspective, if they know what a job is waiting for them at the end of their skills education program, what impact does that have on their mindset and their likelihood to persist and complete the program?
Thank you for your leadership and your question.
Microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership and your question, Chairman Owens. In our work with employers, we see that employers having buy-in in the system creates a really different experience for learners. There is essentially skin in the game on both sides to know that learners will have better outcomes when they know that a job or the potential of a job is available to them after a program. Employer involvement also ensures that learner-focused outcomes are improved and drive success of the program. At Cengage Group, we are innovating these skill-to-hire and talent pipeline models with employers with high workforce demands, particularly in healthcare, cybersecurity, and other high-demand industries, where employers will sponsor the education of learners who, through their success, are able then to prove their ability to do those jobs and get hired by those companies where we support the on-the-job and work-based component of those trainings. We see them as a very successful model, and I've seen them over my career as that.
Thank you so much for that. Without objections, I'd like to submit letters for the record from Little Workforce Policy Institute, the Society for Human Resource Management, and the National Retail Federation, each of which discuss various ways in which the WIOA system could be strengthened to better meet today's economy. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member for the purpose of questioning the witness. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Beasley, we know that these programs help the individual taking advantage of the program. Can you say a word about how these programs benefit the economy generally?
Thank you for the question, Representative Scott. Let me share with you, as a workforce leader that provides services in South Florida, our programs are designed specifically to help our employers find talent. We have a rule or a motto in our region: the only customer that we have is the employer, and our job seeker is the product. And our role really is to reskill, retool that job seeker to align its skills to meet the needs of the employer. Oftentimes, we look at workforce development as a social service program, and truly it is not. It is economic development. And if we can drive talent, it helps grow that company so that they can grow their business.
Thank you. Typically, how much do these programs cost?
In our programs, last year we invested over $39 million in our community. We placed over 7,000 folks, and we have a cost per placement roughly about $3,300. We generated over $360 million back into the community in South Dade.
Now, we've seen studies that show many families can't come up with $400. If the workers had a way to pay for these programs, could you provide more training? We're considering, for example, use of Pell Grants for job training programs.
I think in the workforce sense, I think it's a combination of how we leverage resources. The opportunity for us to provide these dollars, again, these are our community's dollars, the public servants. We're here to ensure that they actually have access to these programs. What we should pay for them, the general public has already paid for them through their tax dollars. Our role is to be able to assist them and be able to afford them the chance to get retrained, reskilled, and then connect them to jobs.
If they had access to a Pell Grant, you'd be able to train a lot more people in your program. Is that right?
Well, if they have access to the Pell Grant, it's a way of us to leverage those resources. And so if Pell paid for the training first, we can then use those dollars as support services to enhance that individual to complete their program.
Can you say a word about how important support services, some call them wraparound services?
So support services are very vital. And as you all know, in this economy, most working families are having difficulties making ends meet. And by utilizing support services, it enables that individual to successfully complete the program, but it provides a safety net to allow them to reskill, retool themselves, to acquire additional jobs to pay more, but it also helps them be able to become self-sufficient. So they're very vital to the success of that individual completing.
Thank you. How can we enhance youth opportunities, particularly summer jobs?
Well, one, Congressman, it'd be great to have additional resources, but more importantly, the flexibility in our regulations allowing the expansion, as I mentioned before, that any individual who lives in an opportunity zone to become income eligible. So it allows us as workforce board leaders to target those underserved populations and offer them an opportunity to get training. Be more flexibility in terms of affording us to have summer employment programs that enable us to provide additional work-based learning for those youth.
And how can we expand those opportunities?
How can we expand opportunities? By through legislation, giving us the flexibility. Again, as I mentioned, it's not just the resources, it is the flexibility to be able to target those individuals and not having barriers because of income and eligibility guidelines that prevent us from really working with those youth that really need it, particularly those who are ex-offenders, youth offenders, those who are teen parents. Allow us the ability to be able to work with them and use our resources to help them.
You mentioned offenders. What can we do for second chance opportunities, justice-involved individuals, those returning from prison?
Well, in our particular region, we target individuals. If you look at our data, Representative, 30% of my outcomes are individuals who are ex-offenders. I can tell you 35% of our positive outcomes are individuals who are welfare recipients. And about 50% of the individuals in total are individuals who have a high school diploma or less.
And how successful are you? If they can get a job, they're much less likely to go back to prison.
Our recidivism, I have not calculated our recidivism rate, but we work with organizations to prevent them from going back to the institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize full committee chair, Ms. Fox.
Thank you, very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for their testimony and their written testimony and the very specific kinds of recommendations that have been made. Mr. Sanders, as you know, holding programs accountable for their performance is a top priority of mine, and it's frustrating that almost a decade after WIOA's enactment, the Departments of Labor and Education still have not fully implemented the accountability provisions. As we consider modifications to the 6 common indicators of performance to better measure program successes, do you agree that any updates should be based on data that the workforce system is already collecting to avoid additional administrative burdens and allow for swift implementation?
I wholeheartedly agree, Dr. Fox, that we should use the existing data we have. Obviously, it would create additional stress on the whole system to come up with the new metrics at this time, and I think that would be the right direction to look at what we have and create appropriate measures.
Now remember, I have limited time, so in my next question, don't give me the whole universe. What are some of the challenges states face when using a statistical adjustment model to negotiate their expected levels of performance?
I'll make it short and sweet right now. I feel as if it is a black box when it comes to the way that the calculations are made. The states don't have any insight or transparency as to how the numbers are calculated, and I think it should be more transparent and an even playing field to come up with what the metrics should be.
So do you believe reversing the negotiations process so the department suggests levels based on their statistical model and then states get a chance to respond and counter with their own data would reduce duplication of effort and help states negotiate on a level playing field?
I would agree with that as long as the department shares their basis and assumptions and how they come up with the figures.
Great. Transparency is the other thing we're looking for in everything that we do in this committee. Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw, in your testimony, you suggest that states work together to streamline the application process for high-quality programs so they can be available to learners across multiple states. Does this type of collaboration become easier if the eligibility criteria are narrowed down to focus on program performance?
Excuse me. Thank you, Representative Fox, for your leadership over the past decade on these issues. The most important outcomes are those that matter to the learner, and program completion and certification, job placement, and an increase or projected wages. Best-in-class providers are consistently meeting and surpassing these performance targets, and these providers often have strong employer partnerships that lead to full-time employment. Congress should encourage states to work together to streamline the process to get these quality providers as many WIOA participants as possible.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bishop, WIOA created a state funding mechanism for divvying up the cost of operating the one-stop center among partner programs. However, it can only be used after local boards try and fail to reach agreement. What are the practical implications of forcing the WIOA system and partner programs to negotiate to the point of failure each year?
I appreciate the question. Actually, the state infrastructure mechanism is something near and dear to my heart because it was something I helped conceptualize when I was at the Department of Labor, and it ended up in WIOA. I actually think that the department misinterpreted the statute because the local memorandum says may, and they, through regulations, said that you had to fail before going to the state, triggering the state infrastructure mechanism. But with that said, the idea behind the state infrastructure mechanism was that we still have in too many communities, we don't have a one-stop system. We have a one-stop system amongst the Title I and Wagner-Pizer programs, and then we have a social services system where you go to get TANF and other services. You've got a voc rehab system and location where you go to get that. The idea of the state infrastructure mechanism is that governors will be able to take off the top of their state allotments and pool those resources to then make sure that each program has skin in the game, so to speak, and then comes together at the local and regional level to be able to provide those services. The problem right now, and I'm working in West Virginia, they literally spend months negotiating MOU every single year. They have to negotiate MOU, the cost allocation, the partnership contributions. They spend more time negotiating MOUs than they do serving clients, literally in some cases.
Well, that's certainly something we'd like to solve. And again, I really appreciate the specific recommendations that we've gotten from members of the panel today. And we are definitely going to learn and improve, learn from what has not worked and improve in every way that we possibly can. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Beasley, you mentioned in your testimony the value of streamlining eligibility requirements. Specifically, you called for automatically qualifying residents in opportunity zones for WIOA services. You claim such an approach could expand services for underserved communities and eliminate eligibility barriers for job seekers. Can you speak on those barriers you have seen for potential WIOA participants? And what are eligibility requirements and paperwork that is so burdensome?
Thank you, Congresswoman Wilson, for the question. As I mentioned in my testimony, the use of opportunity zones enables workforce boards the ability to, if approved, will allow us to quickly be able to make someone income eligible, reduces the barriers. How I feel, Congresswoman, is that the system has individuals jump through a bunch of hoops. They have to prove, poor people have to prove that they're poor to receive our services. And if we had automatically eligibility, it would enable us to provide services directly and streamline that process to get them into a program very quickly, into a training program, or directly into emplacement. And so for us, it minimizes the type of paperwork that we have to collect so that we can determine eligibility.
In the WIOA of 2022 bill that we passed in the House last Congress, we required the use of self-attestation for eligible youth to ease the enrollment process for both the individual and the board. Do you think such a process would minimize paperwork?
Yes, ma'am. As a matter of fact, we as a workforce board have approved our self-attestation policy. Self-attestation allows for participants to self-certify eligibility information. When the ability to provide that information becomes burdensome, self-attestation also should be used to allow for the documentation. When there's a lack of resource or documentation beyond self-attestation, it can delay that process. So for us as a workforce system, it helps us be able to get that individual into a program to help them become self-sufficient.
Okay. And the topic of consolidation of workforce boards has been a subject of discussion. Proponents argue that consolidation can streamline operations and reduce inefficiencies. However, there are concerns about potential drawbacks. Can you provide insights into the advantages and disadvantages of using consolidation?
Thank you for the question again, Representative Wilson. I will share with you one of the comments that the panelists have mentioned here is about data access. And again, from the federal side, if there was an opportunity to kind of streamline that piece to give clarity, to provide data access to not only from the state level, but for the local level, it allows us to be more efficient. And number two, when we actually consolidate, I think sometimes consolidation does provide some benefits, but sometimes it also provides a way of preventing some barriers and the local voice of how services can be provided. Prime example, we're going through that process here in Florida. And you have one particular region that's been consolidated into a larger region. And oftentimes the services in that particular region may not be provided in the way that has been provided before. And so again, when we look at efficiencies, there are ways that I would recommend that can take place by having more automation in terms of the case management systems that we have that will reduce the amount of work that local providers, the staff there, are in the centers that they have to do. The other piece is streamlining the process in terms of data. like our panelists mentioned here, but also encouraging our states to have statewide contracts. The procurement process, it eliminates having those components within our workforce system, and it helps us be able to serve more individuals if those things were taking place.
Thank you. As we explore ways to enhance the effectiveness of individual training accounts within workforce regions, we must have a robust evaluation process in place. Can you share specific performance metrics or key performance indicators that you believe should be used to assess the success of our ITAs?
As our panelists have mentioned, to increase the number of training vendors in our system is great. However, I would encourage that that this panel, this committee, recommend in terms of reauthorization 4 components that we've implemented in our workforce region, and we've had them in place since 2010. The first one is a percentage of training participants that successfully complete their training program. Number 2, a percentage of training participants that obtain a credential or certification after they've completed the program. And number 3, a percentage of training participants that obtain gainful employment. And then number 4, a percentage of training participants who obtain gainful employment but within field. Those are the 4 criteria in which we use in terms of our contracts. If a training vendor's program does not successfully complete those items, that program is automatically removed from our training provider list.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Mr. Thompson, Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. As we have heard in our hearings on WIOA earlier this year, there are a number of areas that can be improved in the WIOA system. I thought we did a pretty good job in 22, but we're always looking to refine and make improvements. And I'm happy to see that each of our witnesses today has offered concrete solutions to help us move forward. Kind of looking backwards very quickly, for anyone, certainly Mr. Beasley, as an Executive Director of Workforce Investment Board, I think one of the key changes, improvements that we made in the last, this with WIOA, was that we required a controlling interest on those boards. And I have to admit right up front, I am a recovering Workforce Investment Board member. That one of the changes was that 50% plus had to be individuals from the private sector, the folks that were signing the front of a paycheck, not the back of a paycheck, or being in line to receive the funding to provide the employment and career and technical education. Has that had a beneficial impact with having our boards have more individuals from the private sector, the folks that are the job creators? Any thoughts on that? Just curious. Ms. Bishop.
I think it's important that they be 50% plus 1, but I would say that I think it's often symbolic and not real in terms of employer engagement. Having boards that have majority employers does not mean that there is employer engagement occurring. It does not mean that employers or the right employers are invested in the system. And frankly, it doesn't necessarily even mean the right people for those companies are on the boards. So what I see often is that we talk about business-led boards, and that becomes a substitute for the hard work of rolling up sleeves and really achieving true sector partnerships and sector strategies and really engaging businesses in a meaningful way that gets them the skilled workforce they need. Additionally, it gets back to my comments on why I continue to talk about the governance structure, because we have so many built-in inefficiencies, in my opinion, that we are not able to utilize the resources effectively on behalf of businesses to get them skilled workers to be able to grow their businesses and expand. And I see that continually in many, many states and locations.
Right, very good. Well, I do think that's Mr. Beasley, any reflections in your role as Executive Director in Florida?
Well, thank you for the question, Representative Thompson. I really think that having a business-led board really provides an impact for us. Like most boards in the state of Florida and those that I used to oversee when I was a state director in Missouri, again, what I'm seeing most boards, they're engaging their business community, and not just those on the board, but the chambers of commerce. I myself am the former chairman of the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, and so we're engaged with them as well as the Beacon Council, which is our economic development arm. And what I'm seeing in most boards is that they are engaged in the business community. They're connecting with them to address the needs of what businesses need in terms of talent supply.
Right, and that's important. And Mr. Bishop's point is well taken, too. It cannot be symbolic. It can't be a monthly luncheon. They got to be rolling their sleeves up. And so a question for Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw. Cengage has a unique perspective when we talk about workforce development. As you noted, you are at the intersection of education and employment, and I appreciate your emphasis on focusing on reskilling workers due to the changing economic landscape, because we know that's happening all the time, the rate of technology enhancement, right? As we focus on filling the skills gaps in our workforce system, I think it's important to focus on upskilling incumbent workers. Investing in the existing workforce ensures that workers can remain relevant for today's rapidly changing economy. So can you talk about the experience that Cengage has had in upskilling incumbent workers?
Yes, we worked, thank you, Representative Thompson, for your question. We work closely with employers to upskill their incumbent populations. Particularly, we see this in hospitals, but we also see this in large businesses that we work with across the country who are particularly interested and in cybersecurity, where they are interested in their workforce having the most up-to-date credentials that are required either by the state and that demonstrate the skills that they need. Employers are making direct commitments in themselves, and many of them don't always know how to even access the funding that may be available to them, but this is a critical priority to them.
And here's my hope. Our workforce, U.S. workforce participation is down 62.8%. Aging population is a part of that. There's some other variables. So I would hope perhaps in this upskilling we could provide skills and incentives for individuals to stay in the workforce longer, because the workforce, that is really the energy of the American economy. It's having that workforce. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. DeCano, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just yesterday, I met with the chancellor of the California community colleges to discuss some of the most pressing issues facing students and their trajectories into the workforce. This hearing comes at a perfect time as we gear up for the reauthorization of WIOA. One of the unique initiatives being spearheaded is the California Military Articulation Program, or MAP initiative, which seeks to maximize credit for prior learning for veterans. This initiative focuses on completion of transfer and career attainment for veterans through granting credit for prior learning in military training. The goal here is to give veterans every single credit they deserve for their previous work experience in the military. Students who are awarded credit for prior learning are more likely to complete a degree in contrast to the counterparts. Furthermore, students who are awarded credit for prior learning save an average of 9 to 14 months to earn a degree. Students could save thousands of dollars on tuition and other related expenses, not to mention preserving their GI Bill for maybe graduate school or other learning. The savings are substantial. So I'm proud to highlight the initial MAP initiative begun at my own community college, Riverside Community College, in my own district, and numerous veterans have been able to receive extensive credit for their valuable work experience in the military. Now, the aim is to deploy MAP in all of the 116 community colleges that currently span California, with the hopes of improving access, completion, and transfer credits for military training. Now, Mr. Beasley, do enough veterans in this country receive appropriate college credit upon enrolling in a college post-service?
Thank you for the question this morning, Representative. I would share with you one of the items for us is to expand prior learning assessments, and again, for those in the military as well as working adults. The goal there, again, is to accelerate the skills so that we can they can obtain employment.
But generally, Mr. Beasley, do you believe that that enough veterans are receiving appropriate college credit throughout the country? Is that your general impression? Or can we do better?
Let me answer this way: we can do much better.
Great. That's thank you, Mr. Beasley. In your estimation, do you believe that we should be providing veterans with college credits for military training? Should we be doing this?
Yes, I do. My father is a military man who served for 27 years in the military.
Great. And what, if any, are the benefits that would come along with providing college credits for training and coursework completed on active duty?
When By implementing prior learning assessments for those in the military, it affords them to take the skills that they've learned on the job and acquire college credit, which then makes them more, let's say, attractive to employers, and it upskills them to, provides the upskill, and it allows us to be able to get them placed much faster.
Do you believe there is value in granting veterans credit for prior learning for their military experience?
Yes, I do.
Now, by creating an additional pipeline of students that can join college programs on an expedited track, the reality is that we would have college graduates enter the workforce more quickly.
Correct.
Now, there are broad areas that may exist alongside military service where we can recognize people's lived experience and potentially explore the notion of expanding credit for prior learning among other people in the workforce beyond our military service members. Do you believe that there are large groups of working people for whom this could be true?
Yes, sir.
And what, for instance, child care workers specifically, could they benefit from such a program?
Yes, sir.
What about home care workers?
Actually, I would say the gamut of all those in various occupations will be able, through prior learning assessments, acquire upgraded and accelerated skills if they were implemented.
So, these home care workers that are getting paid to take care of a family member, people, or taking care of other folks, generally low paid, do you believe that there is, from their experience, they could be granted some amount of credit by a community college or a college for their experience, which would be more inviting for them to actually upskill and to increase their value in the workforce?
Yes, sir. As a matter of fact, we've implemented a teacher assistance program targeting individuals who are already providing early learning education to our youth, and provided them an opportunity to upskill their education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Beasley, for your responses, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Goffman from Wisconsin.
Oh, thank you. Kind of amazing sitting here listening to a bunch of congressmen decide how we should micromanage these local programs. Kind of reminds you why federal government ought to be not involved in all sorts of things and just send it back to the locals once and for all. Just a general question. I was kind of wonder about this, Mr. Bishop. What percentage of high school seniors you think ought to enroll in a 4-year or 2-year leading to a 4-year university compared to the number that are doing it now?
How many should enter a community college, a 2-year, and then a 4-year?
Well, by community college, I guess in Wisconsin, a community college is a gateway to a 4-year.
Technical college.
How many should immediately upon graduation be working towards a 4-year degree in a 4-year institution? Compared to the numbers who are.
Well, I can tell you that roughly 28% or so of individuals in the United States have a bachelor's degree. And most jobs do not, especially higher paying jobs now, do not necessarily require a bachelor's degree. I'm of the opinion that we should be providing high school students with much more direct career exploration and understanding. I talk to community college students all the time, and we have kids spinning their wheels from different courses to different
If you just had to give me a wild guess, we're not going to be quoting you here 10 years from today. Of all the kids who graduate from high school,
how many need to be?
how many should be going to 4-year college, and how many should be looking at, say, a skill where you could make more money and have more job security?
I don't know, 70-30 skill to college, maybe.
Okay, so you're saying about 70% of the people going to college would be better off going to tech school or learning a skill?
Depends what industry
you could be right.
Into.
Other people feel that way.
This is a tough question.
I'd say more 50-50, but if you want to say 70%.
50-50 sounds like a good number to me.
Half
My
shouldn't be
biggest
going-
thing is
that's
I
good.
think people should have the information and data
That's
and
good.
exploration, be able to make the choice that's best for that individual. That's my biggest.
Sorry for showing up a little late today. I was over in the budget hearing where we were passing a budget resolution, and people keep pointing out that 22% of the amount of money the federal government spends today is borrowed, right? And we have kind of a frugal, by congressional standards, a very frugal agreement as far as the amount we're spending next year, and we're going to drop the amount we're spending next year compared to this year on discretionary spending. Nevertheless, obviously, we're almost at the point of no return as far as the amount we're borrowing. What do you think about the idea of taking this whole WIOA thing and just throwing it back on the states and getting the federal bureaucracy out of it?
I would say absolutely, in my opinion. Again, I'll say as somebody who turned 67 in 2034, the year Social Security goes upside down. I've always been kind of nervous about how the budget scenario looks. But I would say that I am absolutely a fan of modifying the rules of the game with WIOA and allowing much more state innovation and flexibility. And I think the more that Congress, through reauthorization, can get rid of a lot of these rules and allow for that flexibility.
Things around here move glacially.
Yes, I
They
understand.
move
Believe
glacially.
me.
We don't
Yes.
want, you can think, do you
I
really
started
want
working on
Congress
WIA
mucking around in
reauthorization
this at
2000.
all?
What's that? I'm sorry. Apologies.
Things around here move glacially.
Yes.
Do you really want Congress mucking around with this at all? I mean, it'll be a small miracle if anything comes out of
I
this
want
committee.
Congress mucking around at it if they will get rid of some of the things that aren't working right now and are hamstringing
Congress
states and
doesn't
local
get rid of
communities.
anything. Ronald
Well-
Reagan said there's nothing, more, whatever. There's
Right.
nothing more permanent forever than a new federal program. So that ain't gonna happen. Should we just clear this out and you can deal with it on a state-by-state basis?
Let me answer it this way. I'm a conservative. I consider myself a very conservative individual. And I had to ask myself when I started the Department of Labor in 2001, as a conservative, how can I be working in these programs? And I'll tell you the answer I answer to myself. I think it's probably the best answer I can give you, is I do believe, and I've experienced over 20 years, a number of individuals for which there is a free market problem. Individuals impacted by global trade. Go to Michigan. When I had to go to Michigan and see 300 people who had been laid off because Whirlpool just ended up going to Mexico or China and having to look them in the eye, and they look at me and say, Mr. Bishop, what should I do now? I do believe there is a role, a federal role for funding employment and training and education programs, but again, a role that is targeted and that frees up the states and local communities to be able to provide those services to those vulnerable individuals. I do believe there is a role for the federal government as a conservative individual, but that role that's being played now, I do not agree with, because I think it so hamstrings and is so inefficient that we're not actually able to serve the people effectively who need these services, of which I think there is a role to serve.
I'll ask the same question. Well, okay.
Is that?
That's okay. We're done. That's okay.
I'd like to now recognize Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Bishop, for that answer. I'd like to talk a little bit about wraparound services. I recently met with the economic development leaders of actually two of my rural counties in my district to talk about workforce challenges that their communities are facing. And throughout our conversation, these leaders repeatedly stressed the need for supportive services. In particular, they talked about the need for childcare and transportation. They emphasized that those were both hurdles to getting people into the workforce who are not currently working. We all know that WIOA's purpose is to help with those with barriers to employment find success in the job market. But there are currently calls to cap or eliminate funding for exactly the kinds of supportive services that my constituents need. So, Mr. Beasley, what can we be doing in Congress to help address the need for supportive services, and in particular, child care and transportation, so that more workers, particularly in rural areas, can participate in the workforce?
Thank you for that question. And good morning to you. Again, as I mentioned in my comments, that Congress should promote the expansion of supportive services to address, again, those items in terms of the benefits cliff. If we're looking at supportive services, again, child care, transportation, and even needs-related payments will assist our workers, our job seekers, to be able to give them a helping hand to complete the program successfully so they can get a job. And then beyond that, be able to assist them to become self-sufficient.
And so would cuts to those programs create more hurdles for getting some of those workers into the workforce?
Well, when you say cuts to the programs, again, when we're looking at the supportive services, and that's why I made my comment in terms of when you look at the ITAs, that Again, providing the definition for training should include supportive services so that they're not cut. Because again, for someone to successfully complete the program, wraparound services become very important to the completion for the success of that person to complete.
I also met with local community leaders and police officers to discuss the troubling trend of youth crime rates. At-risk youth across the nation often face unique challenges in developing the skills that will allow them to enter the workforce. Early exposure to work and economic opportunity can change the trajectory of a young person's life. Yet the current Republican budget would defund WIOA's youth job training program, a critical program that helps prepare young people to enter the workforce. So, Mr. Beasley, can you talk a little bit about the positive impact that youth-oriented services have had on our communities?
Well, let me, again, thank you for the question. I think we need to make a major investment in terms of our future workforce. As you all know, we have a challenge of identifying skills or talent for employers that need it. And I think if we make the investment, you'll see that if we provide career exploration for the youth, it will help them acquire the skills necessary to be able to get an obtain employment. I will share with you, we're working with an organization called AAR, one of the largest maintenance repair organizations in the country. And we've launched a pre-apprenticeship program with them to build talent pipelines. And they specifically targeted those at-risk youth to go into their program. And so when you have employers like that are committed to serving individuals that have some barriers, it allows us as workforce entities to be able to build talent to meet their needs.
You also mentioned in your testimony the issue of benefits cliffs.
Right.
And one of my nonprofit CEOs often talks about the need for a benefits ramp rather than a benefits cliff. How would you address the benefits cliff issue?
Again, thank you for that question. I actually sit as a co-chair in Miami-Dade County on a benefits cliff committee that we have. And one of the issues that we're facing is that how do we help employers be able to maintain their workers, but at the same time provide a safety net to assist. My recommendation to this committee is this. The Federal Reserve has been looking at this component for a number of years, and they have provided a kind of a study. If we could have a sliding scale that could be implemented, that as my salaries increase, then my benefits would then decrease by the same amount. That way, I'm not eliminated. It helps in terms of how Republicans look in terms of eroding or getting rid of a safety net, but it also provides a way of that individual to increase their gainful employment without the fear of losing their benefits. So a sliding scale will be my recommendation that you all implement. As my wages go up, that percentage increase would decrease my benefits.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Smoker from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and to our witnesses for sharing their testimony for today. This is one of the issues I have a deep interest in. I talk to employers in my district. Workplace shortages are one of the key issues they're faced with, and certainly we need individuals to engage in the workforce. We need their talent, we need their skills, and it helps them to achieve their own American dream. So we want to be sure that this program is effectively serving the American workers and their communities. Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw, a few questions just for you based on what you're doing at your business. I spoke with a technical college in my district, Thaddeus Stevens, which is a great school, who said they've been unable to be added to the eligible trainer provider list, ETPL, because the process in their mind was just simply too complicated to warrant doing it. And I'm wondering how you feel about the process. Do you think it accurately examines program quality, or is it like just making people jump through hoops? Do you think it works?
Thank you, Representative Smucker, for your question. And I would say that I think what your technical college is experiencing is relatively common for training providers to access the eligible training provider list. And what we are advocating for is that there is a very clear focus on program outcomes and program standards, and that for those programs that can demonstrate those standards, reliably, that there should be a streamlined process to access the ETPL.
And do you think that would result in more high-quality programs?
I do. I do believe that the streamlining of the process will allow more high-quality programs to, one, access that, and also the transparency will then be there for the learner and employers to know which programs actually deliver results, right? With so many programs on the list, it's hard for both of those constituencies to determine which actually will deliver results for both parties.
Yeah. One of the other areas I want to just ask you about is I think it's really important that we have employers involved in workforce development, in helping to determine the needs that exist. I was a business owner myself for many years, and I serve on the Ways and Means Committee as well, and I've introduced legislation called the USA Workforce Tax Credit Act that would actually create a tax credit for employers who participate, who give contributions for apprenticeship programs for schools like Thaddeus Stevens or other programs, so that they create those kind of partnerships, and businesses are helping to develop the programs. And I was interested in Cengage, like how do you map employer demand? How do you ensure that you're building industry relevant content? Are there things from your approach that we should be learning in the workforce system?
Yeah, I appreciate, and Cengage works really closely with employers as well as industry-leading associations to ensure that all the programs that we meet, both are in high demand and are growing, right, so that they provide real opportunity for learners, and two, that the skills that we put into them, the skills education that we put into those programs are really matching exactly what employers need and exactly what learners need in order to pass those certifications that are required in many professions these days. We see that close collaboration happening at many levels of the workforce, and we then also work with employers to not only map those didactic portions, but also the on-the-job pieces to ensure that there is a smooth on-the-job transition. Those types of programs that you were mentioning, apprenticeship and tax credit, we believe that the increased opportunity of those is going to benefit both employers and learners, and that requires that sort of close collaboration to map not only the skills, but also what does the demand projections look like over time to make sure that those training providers are mapping the number of people. So
Thank you. And one more quick question. I'm sorry, this is all going to be to you. Okay. I think that's all I'm going to have time for. But online options as a part of the workforce development, part of WIOA programs, I think it's really important that we meet people where they are. We ensure that people can have access to the programs. And so, I was part of a letter to try to ensure that high quality online options could be available. I mean, it's the way a lot of people are learning today, and just want to get your thoughts on that.
I really appreciate the question. At Cengage, we believe in student choice, and we believe that all learners should have access to high-quality training and upskilling, and that is critical to actually meeting our nation's demand. The vast majority of students that we work with are oftentimes working multiple jobs, and so they access we have students signing into programs at 2, 3 a.m. in order to further their education, in order to further their career access. Providing access to online and hybrid opportunities that are going to be able to meet those learners where they are is critical for both those learners and for meeting the economic imperative.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you to our witnesses. I'm really glad we're having a productive and bipartisan conversation about reauthorizing the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. It was the first bill signing I went to as a member of Congress with Chairwoman Fox, and it's time for reauthorization. And for the last 2 Congresses, including during the last reauthorization proposal, I introduced 2 bipartisan bicameral bills to develop stronger industry and sector partnerships, provides support for small and medium-sized businesses to attract and retain workers, and also increase workers' access to high-quality work-based learning and apprenticeship programs, as well as wraparound services that will increase the likelihood of successful completion in their workforce development program. And I'm hopeful that those bills, the Builds Act and Partners Act, will be considered during this committee's bipartisan negotiations. I want to follow up on Representative Manning's question to you, Mr. Beasley. Basically the same question I was going to ask, so I'm going to follow up on it. About the supportive services and how important they are. They can include transportation, childcare, tools, uniforms, etc. We really see these as crucial components for equitable and successful workforce development, and again, help people complete the program that they're in. And I also want to ask how those services make a difference in increasing diversity in, for example, jobs in the trades, getting people in who have historically been left behind. In my home state of Oregon, we have an organization called Oregon Tradeswomen. So we have a higher percentage of women in the trades. And I've spoken with a lot of them, and they say these programs change their lives, not just for themselves, but for their families. So increasing the number of people who might not traditionally think of a job in the trades, for example. We also have an organization called Constructing Hope. Wonderful organization. They work primarily with men and women who have been in the criminal justice system, and they have a path to a good job because they learned the skills. So what support services are important to people, particularly people who have not been involved in trades or other similar jobs? What makes a difference, and what will help them complete programs?
Again, good morning, and thank you for the question. I would share with you, Representative, that we as a workforce board here recently actually expanded what we call our supportive matrix. We found it as very valuable to do so. In the past, I think we were able to award up maybe to $2,000. Now that's up to $4,500. And again, living in Miami, the cost of living is very significant. And again, I'll cover the Keys as well, Key West. So again, cost of living is significant. But these programs really are valuable to help in terms of child care, in terms of needs related to payment. A participant who may be going through training may need assistance in terms of housing, and we can use these dollars to be able to assist them so that they're not worried about losing their home, but can concentrate on completing their program. Again, for the tools, for individuals who are coming through our programs, we assist in terms of providing resources for them to purchase the tools. And so they become very valuable.
And that increases the likelihood they'll complete the program.
Completes the likelihood of completing the program, and that's going to be beneficial.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask a little bit of time. So, Mr. Sanders, there's a tremendous value in having high-quality data about workforce participation and program enrollment. Last year, the GAO published a report that found challenges with collecting and reporting data about enrollment in workforce development programs. They identified issues with data about students enrolled in multiple programs, for example. GAO's recommendation was for the Department of Labor and Department of Education to improve data coordination. So this can be accomplished, for example, by updating the statewide longitudinal data systems program. So in addition to incorporating GAO's recommendations, what can Congress do in the next reauthorization to improve data access for state and local boards and increase the coordination between labor and education in the collection and reporting of data?
Representative, thanks for your question. I think one of the things is to make sure that the data being used is qualified the same way. I think that's one of the challenges we have in the workforce area. When you go to education, it's different. I mean, I go back to the old days, it was all our social security number. Nowadays, education doesn't use that. And I think we need to find a way to match it up. The beauty of these multi-state data collaboratives that were set up, we've got the ability through algorithms that's thrown over the wall, matched up, and then you can analyze it. You can look for unemployment insurance to reemployment. You can look at credentials of value. And that's the beauty of having this not necessarily within the federal government, but we can protect it outside, and states can look across state lines because so many states border population areas. Right. And it's the true ability to actually see what happens to individuals you train and educate if they stay in your state or if they go across state lines.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, as I yield back, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from AFSCME urging the committee to recognize the contributions of the Wagner-Pizer Employment Service to the workforce system and encouraging support for merit-based personnel as the foundation of the employment service.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw, in your testimony, you mentioned that 223,000 people receive training through WIOA's Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth Formula Grants program. Given that we spend nearly $3 billion on those programs annually, all of it borrowed, by the way, do you think that is a good return on investment? It cost about $13,000 per person, but I will also add that 109,000 actually completed the program, so using that measurement, it cost about $28,000 per person. Would you say those are a good return on investment?
Thank you for your question. We believe that there is an opportunity to increase funding spent on educational services through WIOA in this authorization by streamlining a number of the administrative opportunities that are at work, and that the critical piece is how much are you actually spending on training individuals, and as you suggested, what is that return on investment? So are we seeing through low-cost programs the ability to actually achieve wage outcomes, achieve those completion outcomes, and with that, then it would be, I think the importance of investing in the workforce is critical.
Do you have thoughts on how we could better leverage that current $3 billion that's been allocated to have a greater impact on more people or to save taxpayer money if it wasn't having a greater impact? How would you leverage those $3 billion to have a greater impact? What would you suggest?
We think that there is an opportunity to increase the number that's spent on training itself as opposed to the administration of those services. While there is significant need in the community for training, as you said, it's not reaching nearly as many people as it could when there is significant need in high demand areas. In our written testimony, we have specific ideas about how to streamline the ETPL to increase the efficiency of that. And if there are other areas in how we might be able to do that, we will be happy to get back with you on points.
Well, since you mentioned ETPL or eligible training provider list, what reforms might you suggest that would help those programs, or would to ensure that only those programs with a positive return on investment are eligible for funding?
So as we discussed, we think there's an opportunity to publish data that includes all of those completion rates and have a baseline of data on all of those outcomes made public. This ensures that there is complete transparency both for the learner and employer, as well as for you as the investors in that system. We also believe that you can streamline the access to that data through centralized tools that really allow you to see wage gains. We also believe that there can be state coordination around high-performing programs so that that reduces administration and allows many states to recognize the same high-performing programs that meet that baseline, and to dedicate certain funds to innovation and experimentation to meet the changing economy demands, particularly from already high-performing programs and employer-led initiatives.
Thank you, Ms. Ms. Conrad-Bradshaw, sorry, thinking of Mr. Bishop there. Mr. Bishop, as you probably know, WIOA hasn't been reauthorized since 2020, and yet, along with hundreds of other federal programs that spend hundreds of billions of dollars, Congress continues just to appropriate money that has not been authorized. In other words, not taking the responsibility to properly assess, justify these programs. And WIOA cost taxpayers in the range of $10 billion last time it was authorized, I should say, and all of it, again, borrowed with the deficit that we have. In your testimony, you talked about financial integration of federal resources and the term braiding. Can you explain more about what that means to braid resources?
Yeah, and again, some of the other questions around supportive services and youth programs, this becomes really important because those kinds of services don't need to be on the back of WIOA Title I if we have the ability to allow states and local communities to better integrate not only their services, but their funding opportunities. So again, what's happened in Utah is because we were able to get a approval in the 1990s of a cost allocation model that allows Utah, we don't have to negotiate MOUs. In Utah, they have a single cost allocation methodology for the entire state where TANF and Title I and vocational rehabilitation, all these funds are coming to the Utah Department of Workforce Services, and then they're able to then utilize all of those funds on behalf of a customer depending on what that person's needs are, versus the normal system, which is a local board gets only the Title I, that's all they have control of, and then they have to try to get the other partners to agree to helping give a few little breadcrumbs to help them out. Again, I would emphasize that in most communities, I guarantee almost every representative on this committee could go to their communities, and there's not a one-stop place you go for workforce development. You have to go at least through 3 different places if you're lucky, versus Utah where you truly go through one door. So there is a lot of inefficiencies that keep people from being able to get the services that they are eligible for.
Thank you for sharing the success stories from Utah that you've seen. And now, and I yield my time, and now I will recognize Mr. Moran from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sanders, I want to start with you, and then Mr. Bishop, I'm going to come to you with a couple of questions. Mr. Sanders, in your testimony, you mentioned the need to give states more flexibility under the WIOA youth programs. I also believe this is a very important thing we need to do. In my home state of Texas, as well as in 15 other states, their workforce boards are allowed to use the allotment of WIOA youth program funding to go towards individual training accounts for in-school youth through a waiver from the Department of Labor. I believe it's imperative to set the next generation up for success in our communities. Providing states with more flexibility, as was mentioned with their WIOA youth program funding, would allow states to have more power to invest in youth who face barriers to education, training, and employment. That's why I'm working with the committee currently to ensure that all workforce development boards across the nation have this flexibility as we look to reauthorize WIOA. Can you provide Mr. Sanders more insight into how we can provide additional flexibility in youth training programs so that we maximize our impact on surrounding communities?
Thank you for your question, Representative. Yeah, I think one of the beauties of working with youth is you need more tools in the toolbox. And I think this type of waiver that states use, it gives them the ability to address individuals that may be more rural and don't have access necessarily with their own school to have training. So it gives them the ability to find an alternative provider. I think it will help individuals exit high school and maybe have a plan A and a plan A, not a plan A and a plan B. And I think that's important for our youth that they make the right decision whichever way they go. So I think those waivers would pay off.
Great, and I'll note, I see heads nodding across the panel. Does anybody disagree with setting up these individual training accounts for youth programs and youth training? Sounds like a pretty good idea to me. It lets the local community, and in fact, it lets the youth help determine their future, and I'm a big proponent of that. Mr. Bishop, I want to come back to some things that you mentioned earlier. I hear over and over again, in fact, I heard yesterday from economic development leaders in my home state of Texas and East Texas, that a number of folks involved in economic development workforce centers and others oftentimes do not choose to participate in WIOA programs because of the sheer magnitude of the paperwork and the regulatory burdens, the bureaucratic hurdles that go along with that. I'm curious if you hear the same things, and if so, what steps should we take during this reauthorization process to cut out unnecessary paperwork and reduce the regulatory burdens?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Thank you. It was interesting to me to hear the questions about military and credit for prior learning and talking about the community colleges, because to me, one of the big weaknesses of the current system is it is not connected to community colleges in most communities. We essentially have the community colleges doing their work, the workforce boards doing their work, and never the two shall meet in most places that I see. Same with economic development as well. You sort of have the three-legged stool of economic development, education, and workforce development. The question is, to what extent are those three legs of the stool actually working together on behalf of businesses and residents of those communities? And I dare say that I think that probably it's not working extremely well in many places, unfortunately. And much of that is because I think, again, thematically, as we've talked about, is that the rules that are in WIOA, especially around Title I, are so strict and so stringent that it makes it nearly impossible for people like Mr. Beasley and others. I mean, you've heard all of the details he's had to weave his way around to try to make things work on behalf of the people he serves. And so, yes, I think you hear all the time. And so what essentially happens in states is you get governors and other state-level officials who the system does not work, And so they're creating their own end arounds. I talk about this in my testimony. I've seen this over and over again. They create their own funding mechanisms to pay for ITAs for youth or tuition for workforce programs. They create their own different separate business boards or councils. And so, yes, what happens is essentially they say, you know, the system doesn't really work, but there's not much I can do about it, so I'm going to create something through economic development that does work.
And just to hit on that point again and to echo, we're looking at the Utah model, and that's a model that seems to be working, but under current WIOA is not something that we can fund. What incentives for innovation, that's a phrase you use in your testimony, should we be looking at to include in the WIOA reauthorization?
Yeah. Again, it gets back to the demonstration authority idea, and I do give some more specifics outside of the demonstration authority, but the reason I believe so strongly in the demonstration authority, because in the 1990s, I saw what allowing states to innovate around welfare reform and social assistance programs did, where we ended up with a groundswell coming up to Congress so that by 1996, we had bipartisan federal welfare reform with the Clinton administration and a Republican Congress. And so I believe the same kind of bipartisan approach can occur in workforce development. I don't think we have all the answers for what works community by community. We have a very diverse country. So I think the best thing we could do is allow for demonstration authority to let governors working with their local officials come forward to Congress, to the administration, and say, this is what we would like to try, this is what works for us, and in return, here's the improved performance we will seek as a result of this flexibility. I think it's just a really balanced and important approach.
Thanks to the witnesses, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel being here. Wish I could have been here longer as well, but appreciate your written testimonies. Mr. Sanders, as you indicated in your testimony, the Employment Service Program provides similar career services such as job search assistance and labor market information as the WIOA adult and displaced or dislocated worker programs. How can the flexibility for states to choose the appropriate staffing model for the employment service improve program integration and reduce the duplication of effort across programs?
I think with the flexibility that I talk about in my testimony, it would give the states the ability to set up the distribution network accordingly. I think one of the pieces that's going to come down the pike with the advent and the onslaught of artificial intelligence coming our way, I think states will ultimately have to adjust the way services are delivered, and having the flexibility to move staff around accordingly, I think will yield in a better product for the job seekers that are going to come through the system.
Well, in relation to states and based on the few states that have been allowed to operate under this flexibility, what are some impacts they have seen, particularly when it comes to effectively serving job seekers?
I think it gives them a better hands-on approach in both Colorado, Michigan, and Massachusetts. They've had that ability to be more flexible. This would go away if the proposed rule is changed. And I think that's something where they wouldn't be able to deliver services on the ground and in the field, and I think that could definitely hurt the individuals in those states.
So something to be considered seriously. Yeah. Mr. Sanders, the Department of Labor's 2022 proposed rule to require state merit staff to deliver the employment service program ends the flexibility that all states currently receive under DOL's 2020 rule and pulls the rug out from under the demonstration states, including Michigan, as you mentioned, that have operated with staffing flexibility for decades. You indicated that nearly all NASWA members support staffing flexibility, and I've heard from local workforce boards in my district that are saying the same thing. If both the state workforce agencies and local workforce boards, the folks on the ground implementing WIOA, are clamoring for this flexibility, why do you think the Biden administration is proposing to end it?
It wasn't really explained in the proposed rule as to why they're making the change. It was something I think states want that flexibility, and I think you let states decide, and I think that's the direction we should be going.
Especially since it's working. So
Yes.
it's your answer is
why change something
we
that
don't
works?
really understand
Right.
except
Agreed.
to gain more control
Agreed.
by the federal government. Well, I hope it all doesn't happen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now start our closing remarks. I'd like to recognize Ms. Wilson for her remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today's hearing helped set the record straight on our progress to foster historic economic growth and invest in creating millions of new jobs across the country. As we discussed today, one of the most important steps we can take to build on this progress is to put serious money behind the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Now is not the time to cut funding for workforce development even further. We must invest in expanding access to skills, development for those who need it most, and ensuring that workers and students have access to only the highest quality opportunities. So thank you to all of our witnesses today for sharing their experiences. As the ranking member of this committee, I'm especially grateful that Mr. Rick Beasley could join us today to share the great work he is doing with the South Florida Workforce Investment Board. Under his strong leadership, the South Florida Workforce Investment Board has thrived in its work to support economic development and provide high-quality, competitive, and better-paying jobs for workers. Mr. Beasley is truly a force in workforce. And with that, he has been a long-time champion for job seekers and employers alike. Thank you again, Mr. Beasley. I know you had to alter your schedule, and thank you for your continued dedication, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and with my colleagues on the committee to strengthen our workforce system on behalf of all Americans. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I just want to say sincerely thank each one and every one of you guys. It's been really refreshing to see the bipartisan solutions. Each and every one of you guys have expertise in areas that you've actually spent a lot of time in, and it's obvious you both all have a passion for solutions, and I appreciate that. It's well overdue. I also want to say that I'm very proud to be from the state of Utah. It's a state that understands what collaboration is, what innovation is, what thinking outside the box is, because we have an end game of winning and make sure our citizens are providing the very best in whatever we're trying to present. That is exactly what we need to have here, collaboration. I think it's shameful, to be honest with you, to see success in one state and it's illegal to export that success to other states. It makes absolutely no sense, other than the fact that that's the traditional DC bureaucracy. We have people who are not only risk adverse, but innovative, inverse, reverse. Is that the word? Anyway, they don't like innovation. We need to change that trajectory, and this is how we get it done. I think the last word we should ever hear in this body is a black box when it comes down to communication, transparency, and innovation. The last thing we need. And I just want to thank you guys again, because at the end of the day, what we do here, and I'll say that I'm excited about being part of a conference that truly is looking at being innovative in our legislation. And the only way we can do that is we have to hear from the innovators. You guys think about this 24/7. You have decades of experience, and why reinvent the wheel when you know what makes the wheel spin correctly? So we look forward to this, and this is one area, again, I see a true bipartisan effort, because at the end of the day, 4 million unfilled jobs. Those are true people, those are real people, Americans, who are losing their hopes and dreams, and we cannot afford to let that happen. So I look forward to having this continuous conversation. I think we're going to get some things done because of the way we're approaching this as a body, and I look forward to getting Americans back to work. So thank each and every one of you guys for what you put in your time today that we spent with us. I'd like, again, to thank you guys for as witnesses and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. Without objection, there being no further business, the subcommittee now stands adjourned.